On Monday, the forecast said hot. By Tuesday, it said dangerous. By Wednesday, meteorologists across an entire stretch of the southeast and south central United States were using words like weather alert day and telling people to reschedule their outdoor plans entirely. And it wasn't just getting hotter. Layered directly on top of a heat index forecast to climb past 110 degrees for 6 straight days in a row, forecasters started adding a second, completely different threat into the same daily outlook, damaging thunderstorm winds up to 70 miles per hour and the real possibility of a spin-up tornado, arriving in the exact same afternoon hours as the most dangerous heat of the day. This is what's actually happening across a huge stretch of the country this week, why the forecast keeps getting worse with almost every single update, and what the specific combination of extreme heat and daily severe storms actually means for anyone caught in the middle of it. If you're anywhere across the southeast or south central United States right now, stay with me on this one, because the second half of this video covers exactly what you need to be doing differently this week compared to a normal summer forecast. Drop a comment and tell me what your local forecast has actually looked like this week, because I want to know how widespread this pattern has really been. And if you want updates as this stretch continues to evolve, subscribe now, because based on everything forecasters are saying, this isn't close to finished. Let's start with the heat, because it's the foundation everything else in this forecast is being built on top of. Across the southeast and deep south this week, meteorologists have been tracking a heat index, what the temperature actually feels like once humidity is factored in, forecast to reach between 105 and 113 degrees on consecutive days running from Thursday through the following Wednesday. In parts of southwest Georgia, the National Weather Service's Tallahassee Forecast Office specifically forecast a heat index of 110 degrees on Thursday, climbing to 113 degrees by the following Wednesday, with actual air temperatures running between 92 and 99 degrees underneath that oppressive humidity. That's not a single bad afternoon. That's a solid week of genuinely dangerous heat, day after day, with barely any real relief built into the forecast at any point along the way. It's worth understanding exactly how meteorologists calculate that heat index number, because it's a genuinely more useful measurement for assessing real danger than air temperature alone, and understanding why helps explain why forecasters treat a 113 degree heat index with such urgency, even when the actual thermometer reading is considerably lower. Heat index combines air temperature with relative humidity to estimate how hot it actually feels to the human body, because humidity directly interferes with your body's primary cooling mechanism, evaporating sweat off your skin. In dry heat, sweat evaporates efficiently, carrying heat away from your body, even when the air temperature itself is quite high. In humid heat, that evaporation process slows down dramatically, sometimes stopping almost entirely once humidity gets high enough, which means your body loses its most effective built-in cooling system exactly when it needs it most. That's precisely why a 97-degree day with high humidity can produce a heat index well above 110, and why that combined number, not the simple air temperature, is what actually determines how dangerous a given day truly is. Here's the mechanism driving that heat, and it's worth understanding, because it explains why this pattern has proven so stubborn. A ridge of high pressure, originally centered over the desert southwest, expanded eastward into the Midwest and south over the preceding weekend, effectively pushing rain chances northward and locking a dome of hot, increasingly humid air in place across the entire region underneath it. Meteorologists specifically noted that a stationary surface boundary had settled in at the northern edge of this heat dome, essentially forming a wall that kept cooler air from the north from pushing south and breaking up the pattern. When high-pressure systems like this park themselves in place rather than moving through, they don't just trap heat, they actively prevent the normal day-to-day weather variability that would otherwise interrupt a stretch like this one. That's exactly why this forecast kept extending further and further into the following week with each new update, rather than showing any kind of clean break in the heat. If this is the first time you've heard exactly why a stalled high-pressure system behaves so differently from a normal heat wave that moves through and clears out within a day or two, a like on this video genuinely helps more people understand why some of these hot stretches drag on for a week or longer while others break quickly. Now here's where the forecast genuinely starts to get worse, rather than simply staying uncomfortably hot, and it's the piece of this story that deserves the most attention. Layered directly on top of that oppressive days-long heat, forecasters have been tracking daily chances for severe thunderstorms, and the specific hazards attached to those storms have been escalating with almost every single forecast update issued this week. Meteorologists covering the Western Carolinas described entering a hot and active weather pattern with multiple rounds of storms possible through the same day, driven by a complex of storms moving south out of the Midwest that, if it held together as it tracked into the region, would produce the first of potentially several. Rounds of severe weather within a single afternoon. Elsewhere across the broader region, forecasters were even more explicit about this specific danger. A 60% chance of afternoon storms was flagged as carrying a real risk for severe weather capable of disrupting an entire day's plans, with damaging winds between 50 and 70 miles per hour, and even a spin-up tornado threat possible with any of the stronger storms that developed. It's worth understanding exactly why storms tend to fire up specifically at the edge of a heat dome like this one, rather than randomly across the entire region, because the mechanism explains why forecasters have been able to track this pattern with this much day-to-day consistency. The boundary between the intensely hot, stable air trapped under high pressure and the cooler, more unstable air sitting just outside that dome creates exactly the kind of atmospheric air friction that fuels thunderstorm development. As disturbances in the upper atmosphere ride along that boundary, they act almost like a trigger, repeatedly sparking new rounds of storms along roughly the same corridor day after day, which is precisely why forecasters kept describing daily, near-identical storm chances rather than a single, one-time severe weather event passing through and clearing out. Let's actually sit with that combination for a second, because it's genuinely unusual to see this specific pairing described with this much daily consistency. A heat index above 105 degrees is dangerous entirely on its own, capable of causing heat exhaustion or heat stroke in a matter of a couple of hours for anyone without regular access to air conditioning or shade. A severe thunderstorm producing 50 to 70 mile per hour wind gusts is separately dangerous, capable of snapping trees, downing power lines, and turning unsecured outdoor items into genuine projectiles. Layering those two threats into the same afternoon, day after day, for the better part of a week, creates a genuinely difficult situation for anyone trying to plan around it. Because the safest response to extreme heat, staying outside as little as possible and seeking shade or water when you do, runs directly into the safest response. To severe thunderstorms, which is having a real plan for getting indoors quickly the moment a warning is issued, rather than being caught out in the open scrambling for shelter. Meteorologists covering this pattern have been genuinely direct about the practical guidance this combination requires, and if you've made it this far into this video, subscribe now, because there's a lot more of this pattern I'll be tracking as it continues to unfold this week. It's worth going through their recommendations in detail because they reflect exactly how seriously forecasters are treating this stretch of days. Multiple local weather teams specifically recommended having more than one way to receive severe weather warnings, downloading a dedicated weather app and enabling push notifications rather than relying solely on a phone's default emergency alert system, precisely because these storms have been developing and intensifying quickly enough that a delayed notification could genuinely matter. For outdoor plans, the consistent recommendation across multiple forecast offices has been to reschedule entirely where possible, and for anyone who absolutely has to be outside during the peak heat hours, to take frequent breaks in air conditioning and drink water consistently throughout the day, rather than only when thirst becomes noticeable, since thirst itself is already a lagging indicator of dehydration by the time it kicks in. It's also worth understanding exactly what a spin-up tornado actually is, since forecasters have specifically used that term rather than describing a more typical, longer-lived tornado risk, and the distinction genuinely matters for how you should respond to a warning. A spin-up tornado tends to be brief, often touching down and dissipating within just a few minutes, generated along the leading edge of a fast-moving line or cluster of thunderstorms, rather than from a single, more slowly rotating supercell that gives forecasters a longer window to track and warn on. Because these tornadoes develop and dissipate so quickly, the warning window is often considerably shorter than what people are used to with a more classic, well-tracked tornado, sometimes just a handful of minutes between when rotation is first detected and when the tornado could actually be on the ground. That short fuse is exactly why meteorologists have been emphasizing having a reliable, immediate way to receive warnings this week, rather than assuming there will be a long, comfortable lead time to react once a warning is issued. There's a specific, often overlooked group of people this kind of week puts at disproportionate risk, and meteorologists have been explicit about calling attention to them directly in their forecast discussions. Pets and children should never be left inside vehicles, even briefly, during a stretch of heat like this one, since interior vehicle temperatures can climb to dangerous life. Threatening levels within minutes, even with windows cracked. Elderly neighbors and anyone without reliable access to air conditioning represent another group forecasters specifically flagged as needing extra attention this week, since heat-related illness and death disproportionately affects people who are isolated at home without anyone nearby to notice if conditions inside their home have become genuinely dangerous. Checking in on an elderly neighbor or family member during a stretch of heat like this one is genuinely one of the highest impact, lowest effort things anyone in the affected region can do this week. There's also a specific detail about vehicle safety worth expanding on beyond the general warning against leaving pets and children inside, because most people genuinely underestimate how quickly interior vehicle temperatures actually climb. Even on a day with an outside air temperature in the low 90s, the interior of a closed vehicle can climb past 120 degrees within roughly 30 minutes and past 140 degrees within an hour, regardless of whether windows are cracked open slightly, since that gap does almost nothing to meaningfully slow the greenhouse-style heat buildup inside a closed cabin. That's part of why this specific warning gets repeated so consistently by meteorologists during a heat event like this one, not because it's a novel piece of advice, but because the actual physics involved are consistently dangerously underestimated by people who assume a few minutes running an errand couldn't possibly be a serious risk. Let's also talk about the storm preparation side of this specifically, because meteorologists have been consistent in recommending the exact same guidance you'd hear ahead of a tornado outbreak, not just a routine round of summer thunderstorms. Knowing exactly where to go if severe weather strikes, specifically an interior room on the lowest floor of a building, away from windows, has been a repeated recommendation across multiple forecasts. Discussions covering this week's pattern. That's meaningfully more specific and more urgent guidance than what typically accompanies an ordinary summer thunderstorm forecast, and it reflects genuine concern among meteorologists that some of these storms could produce brief, fast-developing tornadoes with limited advance warning, particularly if they consolidate into a faster-moving line rather than remaining more isolated, individually trackable cells. If you found this level of detail genuinely useful, rather than just a generic hot weather warning, like on this video, helps more people in the affected region get the specific, practical guidance they actually need this week, rather than a vague reminder to stay hydrated. So why does this pattern keep extending day after day, rather than clearing out the way a typical summer heat wave eventually does? The broader context matters enormously here. AccuWeather's summer forecast for 2026, released well before this specific week's pattern developed, specifically flagged this general setup months in advance, describing a volatile mix of heat, severe thunderstorms, and flooding expected to shape the entire summer across the United States, driven in large part by a developing and strengthening El Niño. That seasonal outlook specifically noted that severe weather was expected to be most active from the plains through the Midwest and Ohio Valley during the core summer months, with almost no areas of the country expected to see below average temperatures for the season. Forecasters also specifically flagged a rising risk of derechos, long-lived fast-moving lines of thunderstorms, capable of producing widespread, hurricane-force straight-line wind damage, becoming increasingly likely through July and August specifically, which lines up directly with the kind of storm complex behavior meteorologists have been describing moving through the southeast and south-central states this particular week. That broader seasonal context helps explain something important about why this week's forecast has felt like it keeps getting worse with almost every update, rather than simply being one bad stretch that resolves itself quickly. This isn't an isolated one-off weather event, unrelated to the rest of the summer. It's a specific, intense expression of a pattern that forecasters have been warning about since before summer even began, heat and severe weather occurring together with unusual persistence and frequency, driven by an atmospheric setup that's proven considerably more stubborn than a typical passing heat wave. When a seasonal outlook specifically predicts this exact combination months in advance, and then a specific week arrives that matches that prediction almost point for point, it's a genuine reminder that these forecasts, while they can't predict the exact day-to-day details months out, are often getting the broader pattern right, in ways that matter enormously for how seriously people should take the individual weeks as they actually arrive. Let's talk about the practical timeline for how this specific week has actually been unfolding, because the day-by-day progression itself tells an important story about why this forecast kept escalating. Early in the week, forecasters were describing a stationary boundary sitting to the region's north, largely keeping the most severe storm chances away from the hardest hit areas while the heat itself continued building underneath high pressure. By midweek, meteorologists were describing daily storm chances becoming a consistent, near-certain feature of the forecast, with each subsequent update adding slightly more specific and slightly more concerning language about the wind and tornado threat associated with those storms. By the time forecasters were looking several days out, some were explicitly extending weather alert day designations further into the following week than their original forecasts had called for, a clear sign that the pattern was proving more persistent than initially expected, rather than showing any sign of breaking down on its own. That day-by-day escalation is genuinely one of the more important things to understand about how a forecast like this actually develops in real time, because it explains why checking a forecast once at the beginning of the week and assuming it will hold steady is genuinely risky during a pattern like this one. Meteorologists were explicit that exact timing of storms and the specific extent of any afternoon heat relief those storms might provide remain genuinely uncertain from one day to the next, dependent on factors like exactly where individual storm clouds developed and how far south any cooling effect from morning storms actually extended. And that kind of day-to-day uncertainty is precisely why checking in on official local forecast updates daily throughout a stretch like this one matters considerably more than it would during a more typical, stable summer week. So what should you actually be doing if you're anywhere within this affected stretch of the southeast and south central United States this week? If you've made it this far into the video, subscribe now, because I'll keep tracking this pattern closely as new forecast updates come in over the next several days. First, take the heat threat as seriously as you would take a hurricane warning, because a heat index sustained at 105 to 113 degrees for the better part of a week is a genuinely life-threatening event, particularly for elderly residents, young children, outdoor workers, and anyone without reliable air conditioning. Build in real breaks from the heat throughout your day, not just when you start to feel uncomfortable, and drink water consistently rather than waiting until you're thirsty. Second, treat every severe thunderstorm warning issued this week as immediately actionable rather than something to watch and wait on, given how explicitly forecasters have been flagging the tornado risk embedded within these storms alongside the more headline damaging wind threat. Know your specific safe room and interior space on the lowest floor, away from windows, before a warning is issued rather than figuring it out in the moment. Third, make sure you have a reliable way to actually receive warnings promptly, since these storms have been developing and organizing quickly enough that a delayed notification could genuinely be the difference between having time to take shelter and not having that time at all. And finally, if you have elderly neighbors, family members, or anyone in your community without reliable air conditioning, checking in on them during this stretch is genuinely one of the most valuable things you can do, given how disproportionately heat-related illness and death affects people who are isolated and without anyone nearby to notice when conditions have become dangerous. Here's the thought I want to leave you with. A single hot day or a single severe thunderstorm rarely makes national news because either one, taken in isolation, is simply a normal part of summer in this part of the country. What's made this particular week genuinely worth paying close attention to isn't any single dramatic number, even one as serious as a heat index climbing past 110 degrees. It's the layering, the same days bringing both genuinely dangerous heat and genuinely dangerous storms, arriving together day after day, in a pattern that's proven considerably more stubborn and more persistent than a typical passing heat wave. That's exactly why the forecast has felt like it keeps getting worse with each new update rather than settling into something predictable, because the atmospheric pattern driving it hasn't broken down the way these patterns eventually do. It's held its shape day after day, and based on everything currently in the forecast, the smartest thing anyone in this region can do right now is treat each new day's update as seriously as the last, because this particular week has so far consistently lived up to that concern.